All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of the live two chapter read of Fostered. I am author Shalina Michelle Tate, and super excited to be here yet again on another beautiful Saturday. Um, so, I am super excited to be here, and as you can probably see on the page you're watching from, the agenda for today, which is the chapter readings of both 5 and 6. And then you can also watch, if you're not already watching, on the Foster My Story Plus Facebook page. You can also catch this content on the author Shalina Michelle Tate page or at Chosen Writer Facebook page. You can also catch this content on the Foster My Story author YouTube channel as well. And if you want to follow along, that link, that grab from Kindle link is right there in the description of the page, the HTTP, and that's short for Amazon.2 and 3 WWRW2W. All right. And so let's get into it. I just want to recap from last week. And so, welcome to another week of the reading of Foster. Once again, I'm author Shalene Michelle Tate, and you are going to hear me cover chapters 5 and 6 of Foster, which is on Amazon. And once again, if you want to follow along, grab your Kindle, right? All right. Oh, I do want to express, if you have read Foster or you are thinking about reading Foster, I appreciate your help. I would appreciate it if you would go to Amazon.com where you can get the Kindle or the paperback version of Foster and leave a comment on what you've read and also rate your experience with the book. And I would love to hear more from you. But all right, so let's jump into it. Don't want to hold you long. These readings could be pushing 2 hours, so I want to get right into it. And then, as always, this content will be on replay so you can enjoy it at your convenience. Fostered, and that's me, Shalene Michelle Tate. And just to recap for you, we've covered 4 chapters so far because I'm reading 2 at a time. And let's jump to the table of contents for those of you who are following along. This content is going to be updated for you very soon. Paired with a journal for you to complete some assignments with your reading. Super excited by the updates that's coming with this, so stay connected, along with some other projects I'm working on as well. So once again, for the last 2 weeks, I covered the introduction, Daddy's Little Girl, introducing foster care, and I Could Have Died, and that was all within the last 2 weeks. And today, covering chapters 5 and 6, I'm going to be reading Hands-On Kind of Person. You can follow along starting on page 65, and chapter 6, Standing Alone, which starts on page 97. All right, so let's jump into it. I am super excited to join you again for another week of Fostered. Chapter 5, Hands-On Kind of Person. So the day I left Miss Hank's home was just as sad as when I left Miss May. I was as equally surprised when the caseworker and new foster parent arrived together. Normally, I'd go to the agency and the foster parent would pick me up from there. Now, I imagine this was approved beforehand, but still, it was another first. So, as a youth, I was, more accustomed to having to go to the local agency and then meet the foster parents there. I'm not sure if it was because of my age, it being basically 13, that they allowed the foster parent to pick me up from the home. But once again, that was a first for me. All right, let's continue. It would be also the first that I would be greeted by a foster father instead of the foster mother. I can recall the day like it was yesterday. Mr. Russell Hilton stood tall with brown skin, a nearly trimmed, or should I say neatly trimmed, mustache, low cut hair, and muscular build. It had started to rain. So during the ride in the truck to my new home with Mr. Russell, it was surreal. He asked me a lot of questions. So I answered, looking out the window at the rain, thinking, well, now I have a real father. Okay, I know he wasn't replacing my birth father, but I felt he becoming a father figure with whom I would connect. 66. So, Mr. Russell expressed how my arrival would probably ease the tension that brewed between Keratin, my new foster sister, and my new foster mother. He said Keratin kept herself in trouble and broke down the people in his family. The Hiltons had an older son and daughter who lived out the state. I found out that my foster mother, Mrs. Latress Hilton, worked during the day while Mr. Russell's job kept him away overnight. Further in the conversation, he painted Keratin as a manipulative troublemaker, and for me not to go on getting on with Mrs. Latress's bad side. When I met Keratin face to face, all I wanted to do was just be a big sister and help her get out of trouble. At the time, I wanted Miss Latress to make up for the mother figure like Mrs. Hanks I had just left. The reality I grew to know was far from the efforts I had planned. So the first day arriving at my new home, I met the next door neighbor, Mrs. Florence Ogley. Before I officially met Mrs. Latress, the neighbor came by to help me get settled in. She was a slender, dark-skinned woman who smoked cigarettes and wore pink rollers in her hair. She had stopped by to introduce herself, get to know me, and give me another heads up about the family. She mostly told me what not to do and also watch myself around Keratin. This advice hadn't come into practice quite yet. I heard the back door open and Mrs. Latress talking to Mr. Russell inside the kitchen. Super excited, I ran to meet her. Inside the kitchen, I approached Mrs. Hilton, expressing how I didn't play loud music and I was really good in school. I was excited about the possibility of having a real complete family. That would be the first time I'd see her smile, and the same night, she made me cry. 67. Mrs. Latress was a medium built, brown skinned woman with curly hair and a strong personality. I found out that Keratin conducted herself exactly how Mr. Russell had warned. While sitting down for dinner, I answered a lot of random questions that were thrown at me, mostly about other homes and where I lived. I listened to Mrs. Latress refer to Keratin as Lil Mo. At first, it seemed that they got along well, not like what Mr. Russell had warned me about. However, this was just the first encounter, and other things weren't yet to come to light. Mrs. Ogley, or Miss Ogley, like Miss May, never had children and had lived next door for a long time. I learned that Mrs. Latress had a mother within minutes up the road and an aunt on the other side of town. The remainder of the conversation was me spilling the adventures I had in different homes and enjoying the food. Miss Ogley eventually left. Mr. Russell decided to, later that night, give me a comforter and sheets for the bed in my room. Well, Mrs. Latress, apparently upset that he'd given me the items for bed, came into the room and said, quote, "That's why you'll never be anyone, do anything, or go anywhere with your life." End quote. Yes, she said that. And I just stood there, shocked and humiliated. After that notice, I burst into tears. Mr. Russell tried to console me, but I had just received a reality check. Looking back, all I can think of is something must have happened previously. I can ponder this now, but at the time I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know if asking Mr. Russell for a bed covering and not asking her made her flip out. It would be my last time as things started to take a turn in the household. I know it seems that I'm picked on more than my share. At the time I didn't understand, and as I look back, page 68, over my life, I realized I was in unknown spiritual warfare. I say warfare because I did not know yet really who God was and my purpose and how he could use me. I understood that Mr. Russell and Miss Oakley warned me about. Now I did. But not only did Keratin get a break, but I became the new target for Mrs. Latress to throw her darts. I also became aware of who Mr. Hilton was. I can now acknowledge Mr. Hilton assisted in stirring the pot of confusion. At the time, however, I felt he was a protective father figure. Preferential treatment started to brew. It was just within the foster family. In every home except, well, for Miss May and Miss Hanks, I experienced favoritism and not towards me. This was especially noticeable with the foster biological children or relatives. So, the Hiltons' home was no different. Often, when extended family visited during the holidays, Keratin and I had to play outside, separated from the relatives. However, when relatives were not around, I experienced favoritism of Keratin over me. I never witnessed the tension Mr. Russell spoke about. This approval was directed at me after that first night. I saw how Mrs. Latress spoiled Keratin, but just as a manipulation tool. At the time, I was 13 and Keratin was 8 years old. I witnessed the influence as Mrs. Hilton coerced Keratin's bad behavior. A clear separation stirred in the household. When Mr. Hilton was at work, Keratin ran free with Mrs. Latress. While Miss Latress was at work, Mr. Russell disciplined her. The tension in the house escalated as Keratin ran to fill Mrs. Latress in on the quote-unquote latest gossip. Now, it didn't matter if the gossip was true or not. Keratin would tell Mrs. Latress everything she thought she wanted to hear. Now, for her to be that age, I witnessed her do and say things beyond her years. Examples included running and telling Mrs. Hilton what she assumed I spoke to Mr. Russell about. Water break. Thank you for your patience. Also, Keratin would practically jump on every male that walked into the home. I had witnessed how a pattern of Mrs. Latress started with manipulating Keratin. Often after school or during the day, Mrs. Hilton would ask Keratin what I said and did during the day. Keratin would take what I said and twist it up, making it seem as if something else was going on. I could be in another room and hear Keratin say, she, she. These conversations would begin when it was time to comb Keratin's hair. Although I was older than Keratin, I certainly wasn't confident. However, it was during these times that I found the boldness to confront the situation. Often in my confrontation, I was made to look like the fool for confronting the manipulation. Another first was riding the same bus with Keratin. Although we attended different schools, the bus made double stops, dropping me off at school last. I never displayed the boldness during the bus rides. I'm embarrassed to say I could never stand up to Keratin on the bus. Keratin would tell other fellow peers what I allegedly did to get into trouble at home. Not only was I laughed at, but Mrs. Latress sided with Keratin in front of the other children. One morning, the fussing between Keratin and I got so bad, Mrs. Hilton came to the bus in a robe and rollers, calling me out in front of everyone. The notion of having a little sister quickly died down as I once again felt alone and misunderstood. Writing this during that time, I believe I couldn't defend myself on the bus because of my past. I had bad memories on the bus and still didn't truly have my own backbone. So back at the house, my only defense was telling on Keratin to Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell always had to discipline Keratin, page 70, for acting up in school. I used this to my advantage because I knew she hated doing homework. So during one afternoon, I told Mr. Hilton that Keratin wasn't doing her homework. Sadly, I felt relief when he'd fuss at her. Mr. Carrington, or Mr. Russell, would tell her to get her homework out, which always made her cry. Looking back, I wasn't aware that Carrington was doing a lot of stuff like a lot of kids her age. It wasn't that she didn't want to do her homework, it was because she couldn't. So let me rephrase that. It probably sounded muffled. I really wasn't aware that Carrington was doing, maybe I'm going to just say this. I feel her acting out was her way of asking for help. And instead of somebody asking her or seeing to her getting help, she acted out. And that was her defense mechanism. So this is just my opinion. I don't know. And a lot of kids, they're embarrassed to say I need help with homework because they made to feel, slow or like they can't comprehend. And as those of you who probably listened in on the last 4 reads, or 2 reads, I understand how that feels. A lot of times you're assumed to not understand the work and therefore you can't do anything else. But that's not always the case, and not every kid has the confidence to go and say, hey, I need help, because maybe at home they're being reprimanded because they don't know something or made to feel a certain way because they don't. So, okay, continuing. Earlier, I mentioned having the opportunity to substitute teach. What I've seen is the same pattern from my childhood. It's not that this is what I was saying. It's not that these kids are bent on not doing their work. They just need help. Often these kids act out, as Carrington did, and don't have any real mentors to pour into them. Also, from my experience, they're shoved into remedial classes labeled problem kids and told they need medication. I'll get into my frustrations on this later because I've experienced it myself, okay? Yet this is what I now can notice about Carrington. At the time, I felt Mr. Russell did a great job of being my quote unquote protector, but it was short lived because he always had to leave for work. So once, while Mr. Hilton was away, Carrington was in the front room talking about me yet again. Now, I see how Carrington became manipulative because she was being manipulated. To get Carrington to talk, Mrs. Latress would ask her questions while fixing her hair. This is the first home I'd ever be pitted against another foster child, let alone foster authority. The only other relief I'd have from Miss Latress and Carrington is when I visit Miss Ogley or Miss Adams. Mrs. Hilton's mom, Sandra Adams, was a sweet lady. I imagine Mrs. Hilton must have gotten her harshness from her dad. I don't know. I never met him, but I feel she had a lot of unresolved issues. Miss Ogley and Miss Adams were the only female figures I could turn to for guidance at that time. Like Miss Dolores, she smoked, and like Miss May, she never had children. She always had my best interest in mind. And each time she visited, she'd give me pointers on staying out of trouble, like Felicity. Miss Ogley took the time to show me how to roll my hair. On a few occasions, I also had the opportunity to visit her home. During one visit, she expressed wishing she could adopt me. This was another first, but I knew it probably wouldn't happen. Not that I didn't desire for her, but I believe rules changed a lot by then. Earlier, I mentioned how transition from single parent to 2-parent homes. I believe the system probably wouldn't accept it. This is just, an observation. I'm not completely sure if that was the case. I often wished afterward that she could. Much like many of my prior homes, I gained a reconnection later in life. Just a year ago, at the time of this writing, I learned that a close association attended the Hilton Church, who knew the Hiltons and who they were, and knew Miss Oakley. I'll later delve into that conversation. So aside from the positive adoption gesture, Miss Adams had the motherly wisdom I needed. Miss Sandra Adams was brown skinned and short in stature. Although soft spoken, I could imagine she was full of wisdom. I never fully knew the extent of everything, understanding just the bits and pieces I had run across over the years. I enjoyed visiting Miss Oakley because I knew she really wanted someone to mentor. I loved visiting Miss Adams too because of the lessons she instilled. Much like Miss Oakley, Miss Sandra Adams was always giving me sound and encouraging advice. She always told me how to stay out of trouble with Miss Latress. I mostly enjoyed exploring Miss Adams' property because there I had freedom. The next door neighbor had a farm with real animals I loved visiting, while Miss Sandra attended her personal vegetable garden. I enjoyed helping her plant cucumbers, tomatoes, and potatoes in long rows in the front of her yard. I especially liked seeing the progress and growth they make. Inside of her home was equally inviting. The Hilton had a big, beautiful home. I considered it a luxury home. Miss Adams' home was always warm and inviting. To keep her house warm, Miss Sandra had this black antique heater that looked like it came from the 20s or 30s, but despite its looks, it did a great job. I loved being in the heated house with her during the cold weather. However, I spent much of my time playing outside until lunchtime. At each meal, Keratin and I chose a big muffin for dessert. I think they were the Otis Buttonmeyer muffins. If you ever had one of those, they're very good. Okay, all right. Unfortunately, Miss Adams didn't bake the muffins, but they were very good. I especially like the chocolate and banana nut bread ones. Okay, I'm surprised to see that. I'm surprised to see them in stores today. So yes, they were the Otis Buttonmeyer muffins. Those big muffins that are so good, and I still love those. That kind of get a day, and let's see which ones. Chocolate, I think, as well. I don't know if I mentioned that, but chocolate is good as well. Okay, moving on. um, Now I think it's sort of funny that I voluntarily went outside to play. That's because I became fond of being around you know, elderly wisdom and often was told by an adult to go outside. So when the news or soap operas came on, I'd always go outside. It's funny because these were the two network programs I couldn't stand watching on television. I believe it's because I didn't understand the intrigue adults had in watching them. But as I grew up, however, it's funny to say that these are the same programs I later engaged. Well, not so much news, but soap operas. I When I got older, like in high school, I was drawn to soap operas. Okay, all right. Having Miss Adams and her daughter living minutes apart was another first. Imagine the proximity aided in the ability to assist at a moment's notice. Aside from the home visits, I was relieved when either Miss Oakley or Miss Sandra visited the Hilton home. At the time, I was still viewing Mr. Hilton as a father figure. Upon a visit by Miss Sandra, okay, so in each reading, like I always do, I usually tell if I'm gonna call on something kind of graphic, and this is kind of one of those moments. Okay, heads up. All right, so upon a visit by Miss Sandra, she pulled me aside, telling me not to go to Mr. Russell about personal information. So my cycle had come on for the first time at this placement, and strangely at that time, I wasn't embarrassed to ask a male for assistance in how to clean my clothes. Yeah, I strangely wasn't. It reminds me of the time when I was in the living room with Mrs. Bertha Patrice and Mr. Angus. I began talking about the school incident with blood on my clothes, my dress, and Mrs. Angus hit my arm, telling me not to say the word blood in front of Mr. Angus as if he didn't know. Okay, she didn't go into detail as to why I shouldn't say it. No one had ever told me how to really act during these times or to not discuss it in any setting. So at the time, I didn't understand that it was a private feminine issue. Okay. Also, I didn't realize it wasn't something to discuss in the presence of a male. another first, right? And at that time, I hadn't kissed the boy or knew about sex. Well, if you attended the last week's reading, I told you about that situation. So let's say not in this home. Okay. I really didn't have any home training or guidance, and no, I wasn't active by that time. So I'll just give you that heads up. Earlier, I shared how Patrice assisted me with the sanitary pad placement at the Angus and Hank's homes. I always had assistants washing clothes, but the Hiltons was a new setting and unfamiliar rules and territory. The day Miss Sandra visited, I had asked Mr. Russell about my bloody clothes, and not because I was trying to be fresh, but look, I really did at that time look upon him as a trusted father figure. Upon seeing me, Miss Sandra kindly pulled me to the side and gave me some new advice. She shared not to disclose that to him. Then she told me how to handle my clothes. Although the advice of both the mentors were helpful, it didn't alleviate the tensions that continued escalating in the house. Going to church reminded me of my stay with Mrs. Angus. Both women would put on a facade, and like I mentioned 2 chapters ago, so Mrs. Sandra, Mrs. Latress and Mrs. Angus, this is who I'm referring to. They would put on a facade. Looking back, I felt that keeping the foster kids, quote, was their good deed within the community. Now I could be completely wrong about this. Page 74, observation. I just recalled the differences of treatment at home and out in the public eye. Further, let me express that I don't ever condone being disrespectful to an adult. This also includes if you agree with the adult or not. Well, earlier I mentioned confronting the conversations of Carrington and Mrs. Latress. This boldness raised up a memory in me about church attendance with Mrs. Angus. She would selectively hear the sermons that were preached. Okay, so I'm about to say this, and it wasn't to be disrespectful. Okay, let me express. So yeah, at church, Mrs. Angus, she selectively would hear sermons that were preached, and when the deacon preached what she thought applied to me, I always knew. Even in my peripheral, I could see her wide stretched eyes and head shaking in agreement. It seemed as if I always catch her staring at me with a long and drawn out I also expressed earlier how Mrs. Angus assumed I couldn't comprehend anything. That same deacon would also preach about gossip and things that she did at home. So to return the favor, I mimicked what she did to me. That sounds bad. Of course, this didn't sit well as she grabbed my leg, twisting it in a painful pinch. Yeah, that was painful. Once again, it was not my desire to be disrespectful. It was just the only burst of boldness that manifested. And also, I imagine some reading or listening to this may assume I deserved that for being wrong. Maybe, but it wasn't my intention. So back at the Hilton Church, you'd think, I was family. Aside from Carrington, I was constantly being told to, sit still, where we were allowed to associate with other children. It's kind of funny and sad to say, but I had a Marshall moment. And if anybody knows about the Brady Bunch, you're probably going to know what moment I'm talking about or about to say. All right, so during my first outside meeting, so if you're familiar with the 70s television series The Brady Bunch, so during my first outside meeting with the church youth, Mr. Russell decided to start a softball game. Of course, I didn't know what I was doing, but was encouraged to participate. And upon doing so, Mr. Hilton threw the ball and it hit me smack in the nose. Let me express that before the house tension, the softball was a peaceful home sport in which we all participated, and that's surprisingly to say. So after the hit in the nose, I went off crying in pain, and Mr. Russell came to look at my face but laughed it off as non-serious. Upon leaving the church, the tradition became eating a family chicken meal from the local chicken spot. Things were much different due to work schedules, school attendance, and favoritism that started to grow within the house. So, starting a new middle school, I quickly fell into place. Although I was ahead in some subjects, I still faced remedial math classes. Let me take a pause right here. So, and I don't know if this is the same for today because things have changed over the years, but when I was coming up, if you struggled in one subject, you tend to get placed in remedial for all your subjects. And I don't know if that still applies today. I don't know if anybody listening has any children that the schools are trying to force you to put into remediation. But I do want to encourage you to just continue, if possible, to encourage your kids right where they are, get them tutoring right where they can get tutoring, and just be careful with those IEPs. They tend to kind of segregate you. It's the same equivalent to remediation, and that's not always what the child needs. A lot of times the child needs good mentors and people to meet them right where they are, and I'm speaking from experience. Okay, so let me continue. At my prior school, we'd already covered many of the work the teachers assigned in many classes. However, much like my prior homes, I was alone in academics and needed assistance in my math. Earlier, I mentioned how I believe I knew how keratin felt. However, I never acted out. I just tried my best to learn and improve. The biggest thing for me was the embarrassment of being in a remedial class. I spoke about that the last couple of times. That I know the assumption is that's very helpful, but for kids who have to go in a remedial class, I'm gonna just say this: that's very embarrassing, and they tend to, and I once again speak from my experience, having to go through that and actually see and witness that when I was substituting, how you get segregated, and then how kids bully you for that, and it's hard to really explain unless you really understand what I'm talking about. Um, yeah, so I just wanted to express that. I hope things have changed a lot better since when I was coming up, but I don't know. All right, let's continue. So the biggest thing, like I said, was for me was the embarrassment of being in a remedial class, and I wore many of the clothes I finally grew into from the Angus home. When I was expressing her home, she would always make sure to get myself and the other foster child thrift shop clothes while she and her granddaughter constantly kept their hair and nails done, um, and got clothes practically every week at the local mall, and it complained about the money they got from DSS, and that was just the reality. All right, but in this home, I finally started growing into the clothes. Oh, I'm backtracking, way backtracking. Came from Miss Hank's house. I was growing into teenagerhood. Okay, all right. So like I said, I wore many of the clothes I finally grew into from the Angus home. Like I said, I no longer had Felicity helping me dress, and I had to fend for myself. As you may have guessed, remedial, dental issues, and weird clothes, and fights with keratin continued to assist in my teasing. However, another opportunity presented itself when a boy took interest in me. Once again, I didn't know how to receive his compliments, but didn't reject him. Once again, I trusted in its expectations I placed for Mr. Hilton. Like I mentioned, um, he seemed like a great father figure and protector. You already know. I couldn't wait to tell him about my day. I imagine some reading may be asking, why did I go to Mr. Hilton all the time? Well, I wanted to talk to Mrs. Latrice as well, but our relationship became strained after she gave me the nobody speech the first night I arrived. It, page 76, became evident that I couldn't go to Mrs. Hilton with anything because she always decided with keratin. So coming home, I found Mr. Russell outside cleaning fish. The first time I saw him clean fish. I felt bad for the fish. I mean, I watched how they struggled to breathe. He scaled them, cut off their heads, and then gut them. Uh, this, as you can imagine, was my first experience dealing with any real death. Although this was the case, I had no problem scaling them after the fact. I guess I was a little tomboyish because it wasn't until adulthood I truly learned how to be feminine. The time I found Mr. Russell outside, I'd grown used to the fish routine. Mr. Hilton told me to come and talk to him outside, and once I finished my homework. When I finished, I met him outside to tell him about the guy at school. Um, I wasn't expecting what he asked me next. He asked, "Oh, you want me to teach you how to kiss?" And once again, I never asked him to teach me that. All I was doing was expressing about this guy liking me. And this was his response to that. Yeah, he did just ask me that. I felt awkward and asked, "What?" And he continued, and, "Well, I can't teach the guy how to kiss." Shaking my head, no. I was grossed out because, once again, I mean, he was like my dad. So during that conversation, I wasn't or wouldn't be surprised if Keratin was on the other side of the door listening. I retreated inside where the next few weeks were difficult. Mr. Russell's behavior started to take a turn for the worse. Now I was shaken from that conversation, but slowly started trusting him again. During the following weeks, Mr. Russell started asking Keratin for kisses on his cheek. Once Keratin and I were settled in from school, Mr. Russell gestured to him. He pointed to his cheek, and I followed Keratin, who kissed him first. This must have happened about 3 days in a row. I didn't take any mind to it because Keratin kissed him also. On the third day, things changed. When I, page 77, approached him to kiss Mr. Hilton on the cheek, he turned in time for our lips to meet. Bad taste in my mouth. Wiping my mouth, I said, "Ew," in disgust. I didn't realize this was new fuel for Keratin to go tattle. Although I was disgusted, to Keratin it was new juicy gossip for her really time alone with Miss Hilton. I imagine some of you listening to this may feel that I was very naive. And I would say to you, you're right. I was. And I didn't know what to expect. I mean, I always looked for the good in people despite the wrong. This is a lesson I have to carry well into adulthood. Like I said earlier, I was never taught what to look for in people. I didn't know I had to watch myself around adults. Now, this reminds me of the caseworker whose car I got into in my childhood. I had to defend myself against Keratin again. So back to that childhood, I mentioned back in chapter 1 how this social worker came to pick me up from the daycare. And at the time in the 80s, carefree, not to get in cars with strangers or talk to strangers. And I just trusted him saying, "Oh, he already talked to the daycare staff." And the next thing I know, I'm ending up at the social services, sitting on a bench waiting to meet a social worker and be placed in foster care. And I went with him because he said it was okay. Okay, let me continue, right? So, I'm finding my space, right? So, yeah, like I said, this reminds me of the caseworker whose car I got into in my childhood. I had to defend myself against Keratin again, and I expressed how Keratin kissed Mr. Russell on the cheek also. So Mrs. Latress fussed, telling us not to kiss Mr. Hilton no more. Yet, I knew she especially meant the message for me. I now feel that Kiss report aided visiting Miss Adams in the weeks to follow more than, so basically that aided in me visiting Mrs. Adams more than normal. In the weeks to follow, more things started happening. When we had visitors that started coming in and out the house, One of the visitors was Mrs. Hilton's son, who'd come out of state to visit. At the time, I only knew he lived in Atlanta, Georgia. Preston had to be in his mid-20s to early 30s. He was brown-skinned with a medium build and close-cut haircut. Once again, once Keratin saw him, she ran to him, jumping all over him. It's not until the time of this writing that I know the deal. And what do I mean by that? I will reveal that. I now know what the deal was with that. So during another family gathering, Keratin instantly ran and jumped all over Preston. It wasn't a normal hug, as I noticed she jumped and wrapped her legs around him. I noticed she did that a lot previously with any male that entered the house. I asked Mr. Russell why she did that. Quote, Mr. Hilton shared with me about her past. She had been sexually abused in her biological home. He could have left it at 78. He could have left it at that for my understanding. But then he continued, quote, if someone were to make a pass at her, she wouldn't say anything. Let me read that again. Quote, he continued, quote, if someone were to make a pass at her, she wouldn't say anything, end quote. Just rereading that right now. Oh my God. I was so naive. Oh my gosh. At that moment, I was naive, like I just said, not to register. This may have been a red flag. The conversation ended when more people came inside. I believe it was the holidays around this time because a lot of people and their family members were visiting. These were the times I mentioned earlier when Keratin and I were always told to go outside. Without fail, during special occasions, I always ended up holding Mr. Russell's hands. This only happened as we stood around to pray for the food. During these new occasions, it seemed that Mr. Hilton found me. I never had issues holding his hand before. It must have been around Thanksgiving because the food and the visitors. I believe the dinner lasted the course of over the weekend. So therefore, we had 2 separate nights of food and prayer. So each night we gathered for prayer. I ended up holding Mr. Russell's hand. Both nights I had to yank my hand away during prayer. Twice, Mr. Hilton had started scratching the palm of my hand with his middle finger. Both times I itched and it felt weird. And even though I was a teenager, I didn't know at the time what that meant. Like I said, I will be recalling on some graphic situations I've been through. So just to give you a heads up. So I now understand that this understanding only, let me go back. I later learned it meant he wanted to have sex. Let me pause right there. And you're probably asking, what was that? So if somebody holds your hands, and of course I was naive at the time, so I didn't know what this meant and never counted it. This was the only time in my life this has ever happened to me. If a guy holds your hand and he's all of a sudden scratching the middle of he's taking his middle finger and scratching the palm of your hand while you're holding his hand, that's what that means. Okay, let me continue because I could be here for 5 hours, but I'm trying not to. Yeah. So this understanding only came out at my next placement. So I didn't figure out what that meant until my next placement. All right. So the girl on the date, this is when this came out. So a girl on a daytime talk show shared how she had the same experience. When she revealed it, I was told, So basically, I was at my new home and I basically saw a girl on a talk show basically saying she went through the same stuff and whatnot, and it was revealed to me there. And so asking the new foster mom what it meant, I broke out crying when she revealed it, and I was told to wash my face in the bathroom. So that's what happened. Okay, so returning, I was asked if I was okay, and then I decided to share what happened. And, until that conversation, I decided to find someone else hand to hold during those occasions. So, so basically, after that second time, I just purposely found anybody else's hand to hold, even though I didn't know at the time. Even though I did not at the time know what that meant yet, because that wasn't revealed into the next home. So I hope that made sense. Okay, continuing. The next few events would continue to escalate to my voluntary removal. A few weeks later, I had just come home, top of page 79, settling down from school. I had to go straight to the bathroom once I got inside. So the hallway bathroom had 2 doors separating the main sink from the shower and toilet. I believe Keratin was outside somewhere and never saw, because I never saw her. She's always sneaking around places. So I believe Keratin was, like I said, outside somewhere. The main door to the bathroom was open. When I went to wash my hands at the sink, within transit, I then looked up to notice Mr. Hilton coming to the door in his red nightrobe. In an apparent gesture to flash me, I screamed while slamming the door in his face, and Mr. Hilton walked away laughing at my reaction. Now, thank God, I didn't see anything, but just the gesture of him doing that, it just, yeah, I can just picture it now. Okay, let me continue. I don't want to get off track. I was in some weird homes. Okay. So, I must have waited 10 minutes or so before exiting the bathroom. And yes, I said gesture to flash. And as I didn't know what to do but attempt to collect myself, I slowly pulled away from trusting Mr. Hilton. Finally, I basically said slowly, because the child in me wanted to still believe he was still a father figure. So one evening following that incident, I could hear Keratin in the kitchen. Let me express that moment was my breaking point. And once again, let me also express that in no other home, and maybe because this was the only home this happened to me in, kind of put me in the situation to react this way and do this stuff. I never confronted stuff like this, and I never had to pit myself against another foster child. And it was just not a great situation to be in. Let me continue though. So one evening, following that incident, I could hear Keratin in the kitchen, and let me express that moment was my breaking point. Sure was. She saw me enter the kitchen and stopped talking to Miss Latress. I came in defending myself and became more frustrated. And once again, let me express, it's never all right to be disrespectful to any adult, and that was not my intent. I just was trying to just confront the situation. I was just tired of it. Yet, the escalation and tension made me feel like an outcast and a prisoner in the home. I felt like an outcast because I couldn't share in the motherly affection I wanted from Mrs. Hilton. And I also felt like a prisoner because I didn't know who I could confide in. Well, at least about Mr. Russell's progressively inappropriate behavior. And during the heat of my frustration, I can finally reveal how I felt about the favoritism. I explained to Mrs. Hilton that she treated Keratin like she was a little angel. And in response, Mrs. Hilton expressed, yes, she is an angel and you're the devil. Yes, she said that. And yes, I felt crushed. Except for the never go anywhere speech when I first arrived at the home, top of page 80. I came to realize I lacked the love I always wanted from a family. I felt I didn't have a mother to nurture me, a sister to love on, and a father to protect me. So I finally came to the truth that God is the void in our lives. I'd like to take the time to express that I never showed Mr. Russell's, I never showed Mr. Russell any misleading interest. I constantly only believed that he represented the father I didn't grow to have. I can imagine that, well, some listening or reading may feel, I played a part in my ordeal. Well, I'm aware of how that could be assumed, really an assumed perception. I'm always aware of how many young girls fall into the category due to survival mode. Many displaced youths have felt that they needed to prostitute themselves to survive. Others have been in abusive situations and have adapted to the unsettling situations as results. Many more have been sold into prostitution rings, human trafficking, and have a recollection or relation to the perpetrator. This isn't to downplay their ordeal, but to acknowledge the stereotypes of youth in the system and on the streets. This newly reality for me contributed to the thoughts of feeling imprisoned. My new apparent distance became a joke to Mr. Hilton and a greater notice to Mrs. Latrice. Looking back, I never fathomed myself as any threat, especially to an adult. This would be a new lesson about life I came to learn on my own. So during my writings, I finally understood how Mrs. Hilton perceived me. I don't know how many foster daughters the Hiltons had before Keratin. I now understand why Mrs. Latress treated me how she did. I think she felt I wanted her husband. I've heard of things like this growing up, but never had the desire to engage in it myself. And due to my apparent distance, Mr. Russell became equally unfriendly. He wasn't as fatherly as he always seemed, and this new situation would spill over into my final ordeal. So, topic 81. The Hiltons needed permission to take Keratin and me out of town, and normally we stay at Mrs. Adams, but this time we were allowed to commute. This seemed to be an emergency trip, and I don't know why we had permission to go. The only thing I could gather was that Preston had a major car issue, and also I don't know if our attendance was about the timing of the emergency. Consequently, I took my first out of town trip with the Hiltons to Atlanta, Georgia. And once we arrived, Mr. Russell went off to help Preston with the car. While Miss Latress took Keratin shopping, I was left at home of Karen Richards and the Hilton's daughter. So Karen was tall, light-skinned, and slender. Unlike Mrs. Latress, she was much friendlier and considerate. Her husband, Mr. Terrence Richards, seemed to be the tough disciplinary of the family. Mr. Richards was much taller than Keratin, with a brown complexion and strong build. To me, he seemed to be from either an athletic or military background. The Richards had 2 boys and 1 girl younger than me. The children were all lanky, brown-skinned, and playful. I played dolls with Natalie while Stan and Harris wrestled and later went to play outside with some friends. As the hours became nightfall, we eventually ate and prepared for bedtime. The Hiltons and Keratin hadn't arrived, so I was told I could stay up. Mr. Richards brought me some cookies, while Mrs. Keratin told me I could watch television. So before those instructions, I had settled down in a sleeping bag in the kids' room. And yes, I said sleeping bag. I wasn't aware that the TV room was set up for the Hiltons and the kids shared a bunk bed that my back was turned to while I attempted to get comfortable on the floor. After being told I could stay up, I took my sleeping bag and the cookies with me across the hall. I recall becoming engaged with the Rambo movie until I heard the door downstairs. Just to give you a heads up, I will be calling some graphic situation. Okay, I'll just give you that fair warning. All right. At the time, I started to panic as I thought it was Mrs. Hilton coming upstairs. Upon seeing Mr. Hilton, I quickly got up and headed back across the hall. However, Before going, he expressed, "So I'm just going to change into night clothes. You come back after to finish watching your movie." Ugh, I was so naive. Okay, let's continue. Once again, let me express that I was very vulnerable and naive 13-year-old girl. And like I just said that, right? I continue to only see Mr. Russell as a father figure and not as a grandfather to, and now as a grandfather to his grandchildren. So when the door reopened, he called me back to the room, re-entering and very hesitantly re-entering. And God, I resumed where he found me wrapped up, sitting on the floor in front of the TV. I was never alone in a room with Mr. Hilton, let alone with him in night clothes. He changed to a white T-shirt with flannel pajama pants. I was very hesitant when he started beckoning me to sit on his lap. Yes, I said he wanted me to sit on his lap, and this just this just felt as awkward as the kissing lesson and flash attempt. And instead of just going back to the room I was sleeping, I continually shook my head no at his beckoning. After the third time or so, don't ask me why, I hesitantly approached him, still wrapped in my sleeping bag. I know you're asking, what was I thinking? Yeah, please, but I'm asking myself that too. Well, I don't know. I mean, I never been in this situation until that moment. I felt clenched and hesitant, but it didn't help me take flight. Instead, I felt like I was a little girl about to get in trouble for not listening. I know it sounds weird, but yes, I was now, 13. But once again, what do you do in the face of sexual adversity? I asked this earlier, and the perpetrator was someone I was supposed to trust. Also, it's easy to say what we wouldn't do until we face the actual scenario. And before this week, I kind of asked, what do you do if it's somebody you, like a family member or somebody you trust or an authority figure? Like, I know we take sex ed in school, but, we're not taught how to deal with those in your face right now situations, how to handle that. I don't, if somebody, is listening and want to comment on something similar, feel free to do so. And you don't have to say, if you don't feel comfortable. But, or if you have some advice you like to share in the comment section for, young girls, besides that may be helpful, please do so I can, read it at the end of this reading. Okay. So I asked earlier, and the perpetrator was someone I was supposed to trust. Also, it's easy to say what we would, like I just read, what we wouldn't do until we face into the actual situation. In approaching him, I didn't think anything was going to happen, but I was still hesitant. And once again, I'm still wrapped up on my, in my sleeping bag. So it wasn't like I just like, oh, let me just go sit on his lap and skip. I didn't skip over there. It was just like, I don't know. It's like that moment put me in a little girl state of I'm gotta listen or else I'm gonna get in trouble. I can't explain it. And maybe because that was my first time going through it and feeling that way. I can't explain it. So sitting on his lap, I realized that was far from the truth, that nothing was going to happen, as he kept expressing. I had on a large nightshirt and underwear, and I quickly realized he didn't have on underwear. I could tell because I felt his warm excitement on my leg. I became distracted by his large hands reaching in my underwear. I jumped up from his lap, but he pulled me back before I could get away. He groped my chest. During his new action, we heard the door opening downstairs. I quickly jumped up back in my spot with the sleeping bag. Instead, Mr. Russell told me to quickly go across the hall and pretend I was asleep. And leaving the room, I felt violated, humiliated, and panicky all at once. I'm grateful penetration didn't happen because I was still a virgin. My heart does go out to youth and adults who have been molested at the hands of known predators. My heart equally goes out to anyone who's ever been in any type of abuse. I can imagine it's even more traumatic if it's someone you've known. And I hate to say this, but I hear of so many of these situations in foster care. I hear of so many further than what I went through. And it breaks my heart. It's already bad enough you have to deal with it with your own family or people you know, but to have something like this happen to you in foster care. Okay, let me continue. Back in the sleeping bag in the kids' room, I bawled myself up in fear. I was scared knowing Miss Latress was coming upstairs, and I was more horrified when it was apparent she stopped and stared at me because I could feel her presence there. Mrs. Hilton must have stood there at the door opening to stare in the doorway for a good 5 minutes. And at the time, I didn't really understand, but it was a woman's intuition type thing. And in that moment, she had a right to be staring, even though, gosh, I was so naive. Okay, let's continue. Now, my eyes weren't open, but I felt her presence standing there. I tried my best not to move or even breathe. Eventually, she entered the room with Mr. Hilton. What was more hurtful was that she took Keratin inside with her. So, in other words, they basically let Keratin sleep in the room with them, which wasn't even better. So, I don't know. Looking back, some stuff must have been happening to her before I came. It had to have been for that tension to have been with Mrs. Latress. It had to be because for him to like go into that whole spiel that I didn't ask him about the first day riding to the house, he was trying to cover up for himself. But at the time, I didn't understand that, and I didn't understand that that was a red flag. I didn't understand any of that. Let's continue. So once the door closed, I laid there shaking and quietly sobbing. I was trying not to wake the other kids and eventually went to sleep. During breakfast the next morning, I purposely kept my distance from Mr. Hilton. I instead started engaging my time with his grandchildren, but I wasn't aware that my distance from him became easily apparent. Mrs. Latress was upstairs briefly, and the next minute she was gone. Oh, Mrs. Latress was downstairs, briefly, and then the next minute she was gone. 10 minutes or so, everyone rushed upstairs to attend her side. In the room, she was professing to everyone that she was sick. I didn't think at the time that it had anything to do with me, and at the time, I didn't feel I did anything wrong. I now imagine some readers or listeners may ask, why didn't I tell Miss Latress what happened? Well, what can I say in an already strained relationship? Those answers soon came out, but only after we returned home. The trip back home was long and silent. I couldn't help but replay what happened. I also noticed how quickly Mrs. Hilton recovered from her sickness. I'm saying this due to a third degree I got returning to the house. After Mr. Russell left for work, Mrs. Latress called me in the front room. At the time, she told Keratin to leave the room, which was shocking. This didn't help, as Keratin defiantly peeked in and listened. Mrs. Hilton asked, quote, "What's going on between you and my husband?" Okay, let's continue. She said, yes, she asked me that, and at the time I felt I had nothing to hide, which I didn't. And writing, like the time I was writing this, I know for sure she assumed something the day I arrived. It was not only until later I knew this was what she really felt. I decided to recant every question, moment, and gesture. I felt that instead of looking at me as the initiator, I could finally release what I'd been carrying. Afterward, I felt that we had a brief connection, but I didn't know to what extent. And Keratin and I were then told to put on our shoes and go for a ride in the car. We picked up Miss Adams and rode to see her sister, Miss Stables. Miss Geraldine Stables resembled Miss Adams in stature and feature. Like Miss Adams, she wore glasses and had a motherly demeanor. I wondered why we rode across town to her house. Inside the living room, I was surprised to see Keratin get chastised. Miss Latress had already told Keratin to go into another room, but she didn't listen, of course. Inside the living room, I was asked to repeat everything I had told Mrs. Hilton earlier, and once again, I was confident because I had nothing to hide. At the time, I didn't feel that they perceived me as the initiator. Therefore, my call stayed the same, and we went, or basically we spent all night at Mrs. Sterling's house. The next day, I was nervous when I saw Mr. Hilton entering the house. I was called to the front and asked to repeat everything. Yet again, this time I had to expose what Mr. Hilton did in front of him. And once again, I stayed consistent because I didn't feel I was at fault for anything. Afterward, Mrs. Latress repeatedly asked Mr. Russell, "Why, Russell, why?" His response was, quote, "Because I'm a hands-on kind of person," which is the title of this chapter, hands-on kind of person. Okay. Yes, he said that, and I've never felt more used, rejected, and embarrassed. These emotions were just due to his response, but the fact, well, they weren't just due to his response, but the fact that I never had a real family with the Hiltons. Recapping it, I lived with a manipulative, sexually abused 8-year-old, a bipolar, imaginative housewife, and a father figure that was a real pedophile. Let me repeat that. And I know it sounds bad, but that's the way it all kind of sums up to. Recapping it, it seemed I lived with a manipulative, sexually abused 8-year-old, which that's probably what was happening to her. Now, looking back at his response, if something were to happen to her, she'd never tell. A bipolar, imaginative housewife, which is so sad because, okay. And a father figure that was a real pedophile. Despite addressing each as such, I've grown in understanding in my writings. These are just my observations and new beliefs. Keratin couldn't be a sister because she hadn't been healed from past abuse. Mrs. Latress couldn't be a mother figure because Keratin and I weren't the only ordeals with Mr. Russell. Meaning that I felt my situation wasn't the first to happen with Mr. Russell. And I also believe that due to it, Mrs. Latress already had her guard up and didn't trust me due to my age. Equally, Mr. Hilton couldn't be a father figure because he'd gotten away with being a pedophile for so long. That sounds bad. But that was the situation. Because he'd gotten away with it for so long. That's it right there. Man. Let's continue. Looking back reminds me of the trust DSS has in potential foster parents. Anyone can paint themselves as trustworthy in parental material. Growing up, I continuously heard stories. This is what I was talking about earlier. I continuously heard stories of molestation and abuse at the hands of foster parents. It's one thing to get abused at home. It's another to be abused where you're placed. I imagine some readers and now you listeners may know someone or can relate to what I'm talking about. I couldn't ever speak in depth about the abuse because I only faced surface abuse. I mean, it's still abuse, but I now know there are others who endured the unimaginable. My heart goes out to them and anyone able to relate. In my growth, I'm learning to view the scenario from every angle. However, that later became known as I prepared for a new situation and a new transition. So a week or so later, my caseworker came by asking me several questions. Mr. Russell was present when Miss Lacey came and asking me if I wanted to leave the home. I was surprised at Mr. Russell's upset expression as I said that would be best. And it's another thing, like, Now reading that, come to think of it, okay, let me read this next part, and then I'm gonna say what I want to say. Now, I don't know to what extent the social services were told about the ordeal, but it led me to me going on out of town to get it examined. I was driven all the way to Charleston, don't ask me why, Charleston, South Carolina, to undergo a physical examination, another first. And as I couldn't stay still as the doctor entered the room, I became fidgety and uncomfortable as the doctor attempted to poke me several times with a tampon. Yes, I said tampon, something I never used, and it hurt because I was still a virgin. Also, due to the fact that I didn't have a case, I was told they couldn't do anything because there was no quote unquote evidence. How many times have I heard that before? I wonder how many other top of 87 pedophiles have gotten away with it because of quote no evidence being found. I ponder if social services were told I was the initiator. I'm saying this because Keratin still got to live in the home when I left. Okay, so let me say what I want to say. Just kind of, reading it and thinking about it, how I wasn't really asked about my feelings. And I kind of thought it was weird. I had to talk with the social worker in front of Mr. Hilton. I should have been put in private. I should have been asked how I felt, and I assumed Mrs. Hilton painted it as if I was the perpetrator and I was after her husband and that I did something. But of course, and I don't know to what extent they talked, but it was like I was kind of shut out of all of that conversation. And maybe it was to protect me, but I was already, despite the fact that I was naive, I was at least understanding questions, they should have talked to me as the victim, and then, but instead I was, I don't know. My heart goes out to those who had worse done to them. Okay. Later, I reconnected with someone who was connected to my past. So a year or so ago, I met one of their church attendees via a community mentor. And 2 years ago, at the time of this writing, I started working on a vision to assist in the community, assist youth in the community. I'll elaborate at the end of this book what it entails. But for now, Mrs. Carly Westgate became a new past connection. Mrs. Westgate is short in stature but full of heart. Mrs. Carlin is caramel complexion with gold frame glasses, salt and pepper curly hair. And already knowing my background, she disclosed how she also knew the Hiltons. This only came up because I told her she was in proximity to their home. I was informed that she attended church with them and they still kept foster children. She continued that within the past few years, it started being only boys. Yeah, so that means some stuff continued, I'm assuming. I was disheartened by the fact, or really the statement, because I felt he still got away with his actions. I suspect that they either know someone or someone is vouching for them. I don't know. I'm assuming that Mr. Russell still got away or really still got in trouble with females. So maybe after I left and then I don't know how long Keratin was there before she had to leave. They only now then kept boys. So that means something else probably happened. And maybe they had some other reports dealing with Keratin. Who knows? Or maybe DSS is fine. We just figured out he don't need to have girls. But if it was thoroughly investigated, he shouldn't have no children. Oh, it hurts my heart even saying that. Gosh. All right, continuing, right? So like I said, I was disheartened by that statement because I felt he had gotten away with his actions. I suspect that they either know someone or someone is vouching for them. I'm assuming that Mr. Russell still got in trouble with females and evidence wasn't found. like I'm saying, I don't know if that was the case, but they're still being allowed to keep children is a kind of slap in the face. However, what I can do on my behalf is forgive and continue lifting them up in prayer. Forgive, you ask? Yes. I have to. Without forgiveness, I couldn't write this book. That's why it took many years to do so. During my early writings, I was dwelling on the hurt from the individuals and beating myself up as well because of, not being strong enough to deal with it or face it or speak about it. And once, again, I'm amazed at how I've been connected to places and people from my past. I'm at the top of page 88, and all of which I never looked for on my own. Miss Hanks and my final foster mother are the only foster parents I purposely revisited. I did in later years take a ride past the Angus home to see if I recognized the setting. During my departure, I asked my caseworker, this is now back to the Hilton home. So during my departure, I asked my caseworker what would happen to Keratin. Yes, we didn't get along, but I had concern for her well-being. This moment takes me back to the conversation I had with Mrs. Hilton. I asked why Keratin jumped on every guy entering the home, and he shared how, quote, Keratin came from an abusive home, and he also disclosed how she'd never tell if anyone made a pass at her. I now wondered if Mr. Russell had a hands-on experience with Keratin. Probably did. Unfortunately, I think the answer is yes, and was told the same thing, that she'd have to come forward if she was being abused. This takes me back to when I was recapping about my brother's situation. They were going through a physical abuse type situation, whereas this was a sexual abuse and manipulation type situation. And the social worker said the same thing there. Like when I was saying, hey, when I get older, I want my brothers removed, or I want to take them with me or have them live with me. And I was told, one, they would have to prove the abuse, and two, them moving with me would be my decision. And then here I'm revisiting it again, being told you have to prove. But that was during the time I was coming up. I pray to goodness. Well, things still need to change. The system is truly broken. And my heart does go out to social workers. I mean, the ones who really truly have a heart to want to help these kids, because y'all go through a lot daily, and underpaid, overworked, underappreciated. I mean, the ones who really have the heart. Let's put it that way. Because anybody could work. Anybody could just say, "Oh, yeah, I got a case." But it takes a special someone to just actually see beyond the fluff of, oh, I'm a good foster parent, put him in my home. Or, oh, well, I know you need a placement for your kid. And you see so much of that now. I mean, even to this day, I read comments of people just asking about tax write-offs because they got a foster child. What? I'm sorry. I go on a tangent. I'm trying not to. What I'm ranting about is, if you don't have a heart for it, don't do it. If you don't have a true heart to really help these kids, as a mentor, social worker, as a potential foster parent, and I pray that the system has at least tightened up on the fact where they do thorough investigations of who they're placing in these homes. And if a situation did happen in a home, social workers, please step up for that kid. Ask questions, visit them. I know you got a pile on your desk. I know, I've seen both sides. You got a pile on your desk, you're overworked, you're underpaid. But if a kid comes with a notion of abuse, listen to that kid, investigate, truly investigate. Don't just put it as, oh, I got to get this quota in by the end of the month. I've seen those cases too, where just to push them through for a quota, the case is closed and they're still putting back in the home of the perpetrator. I get passionate. Okay, let's continue. So, that, like I said earlier, Unfortunately, I think the answer is yes as far as keratin. And she was told the same thing, that she had to come forward, and if she was being abused. And let me say that if any social worker is telling the kid, oh, you have to prove the abuse, why? I'm going on a tangent again. Why? No, and that's another thing. If a kid is being abused, they can't take the time to prove, oh, this foster parent is touching me or doing some other stuff to me. All they know is that they're a foster child. They're put in a situation that they didn't be asked for at all, whether the abuse came from home originally, and then they're getting into a foster family, and then the trust isn't misused there. And then no one's believing them. They're being told by a social worker, oh, you have to prove it. What? I'm sorry, that just got me stirred up. It just got me stirred up. Okay. We need better representations and better people to step up. I'm working on some stuff, for who I want to help, but I can't do it by myself. Okay. It gets me started when I realize this stuff is like still happening. All right. So yeah, like I said earlier, that took me back to what I was told with my brothers about. However, despite my lack of proof, a child. This is what I'm talking about. However, despite my lack of proof, a child won't automatically come forward if they're being abused. That's another thing. A child's not just go up to a social worker, hey, by the way, I'm being abused. It's not like a, by the way, carefree thing. It's an embarrassment thing. It's a shutdown thing. It's a who's going to help me thing, or who believes me. That's another thing. Who believes me thing. And this person, they look so good on paper. They look so good out in the public. They donate to every charity. They look good at church. They look good on the board, the review board, because they're a foster parent and they're also on the review board. So therefore, they can abuse their foster children, and they're on the board, so we can't do anything because there's no proof. Third tangent, right? Well, I just got stirred up. Continue. All right. Please, if anybody has any comments, please comment. Please comment, because I want to engage with you. All right. So, like I said, however, despite my lack of proof, despite my lack of proof, this is what I'm saying. A child won't automatically come forward if they're being abused. The least the agency could do is bring in and cross-examine a nurse for situations like this. So yeah, this is what I think. They when there's reports of this, instead of just brushing it through for a quota's sake, they need to bring in professional cross-examiners, not for just the children, but for the alleged perpetrators, because so many people have gotten away with this, especially for foster kids in the system. It just gets me stirred. All right. I believe if they got a lot of molested victims by themselves, the truth would come out. Yes, I'm also aware that some innocent people have been wrongly accused. I also am aware of that side of the coin. I get it. However, I believe repeated and new accusations should be treated with professional cross-examiners for children. I know this sounds extreme. Yes, this is why I'm suggesting it. Sometimes you have to go through extreme measures, and just because the child is a foster child, once again, a situation they don't have control over 9 times out of 10, and they're already retaliating and lashing out because of what they've already probably dealt with. For keratin, she already came from an abuse situation, sexual abuse. I never went through that, just what I've been through in that home, and so I can only imagine what she went through and the stuff in her. Is reasons that's part of her acting out. And I said this maybe last week sometime or the week before. A lot of times these kids act out at school is not because they have behavioral issues. A lot of times they're being abused at home, and coming to school, that's their way of venting their frustrations out. It's not because they're bad or they don't know the work. It's just because they don't have support. And a lot of times it's because of abuse, neglect. My removal from home was due to neglect. But other kids are being sexually abused and physical, sexually, emotionally, and it's traumatic. It's so traumatic. And then you go to schools that now have, this is another thing that stirs me up. You have schools now that have in-school psychiatrists where the teacher could tell the kid, oh, go see the school psychiatrist. And the only thing the psychiatrist is going to do is tell them to go to the nurse's office and go get on some medication and go get in remedial class. That's another thing. I'm getting started up. All right, let's continue. I'm gonna talk. I see a comment and I'm gonna read it when I'm done reading. And please, everybody else, feel free. I'm getting stirred because I'm passionate about the stuff that I know are still happening, but I also want to be a change to a lot of the stuff I'm seeing and know of and what I've been through, and I'm just trying to find better ways to help others. So, yeah. All right. Earlier, I mentioned working briefly for a social service department as a temporary worker. Yes, this was true when I was in North Carolina for a year. Um, Even though I couldn't disclose the files, of course, I was fully aware that many cases were left unresolved, and handling the files brought back many memories. Reading the files, I often desired to help the victim or that something else could be done. I felt many abuse allegations weren't properly treated as cases, and were permanently closed. And I wasn't a social worker. I was just a temp administrative assistant working on files, and I just knew from the discernment that a lot of these cases were not handled properly. And no, I don't want to be a social worker. I get that all the time. You want to be a social worker? No, I don't. I mean, my the way I want to help is different, and goes beyond somebody being over my shoulder telling me how I can and can't help. I get passionate about that too. All right, I'm at the top of page 89 for those of you who are following. Right, this is just my observation and opinion. I was often later asked, "Oh, here we go. Why aren't you a social worker?" And the answer is because my heart is bent on finding a solution to these issues. Now, I highly respect the caseworker in you know, cases that they must handle, because that's not an easy job by no means. I commend caseworkers. Y'all, I wish y'all got paid like football players, really, because you handle the lives of all these different people that are going through so many forms of trauma that really need somebody that's empathetic, sympathetic, and can meet them right where they are. And especially the good ones that like take the extra initiative. Y'all really need, like, I don't know, some kind of super bonus pay for the fact that you go above and beyond what's expected. I mean, maybe that's something I could put in place. Probably not today, but maybe years from now. Who knows? I don't know. All right. Now, like I said, it takes a person with a heart to handle the files. They're confronted every day. Like I said, I can only imagine it's not easy confronting parents dealing with abuse, drugs, and anger scenarios. I believe caseworkers take on so much, like I said, but are not properly compensated for their times and efforts, like I just said, right? Now, I don't know if it's the same for each state, but growing up, I always heard being a caseworker is volunteer work. And what I've come to learn is that they do get paid. However, it's just the amount of stress, frustration, and disappointment that doesn't compensate their time, you know. Also, the job only allows them to go so far, meaning they can truly get emotionally vested. They can't truly get emotionally vested due to the number of caseloads received. And that is true. I've been in offices, not just as a foster child, but on the other end, like working those files and seeing the social workers day in and day out. And that's just dealing with foster care. I know when you get to other topics like nursing homes and medical and family issues, man, those caseworkers, yeah, I commend y'all. All right, so before entering the Hilton home, I mentioned a conversation I had with Mr. Russell during our truck ride. He gave me the initial impression, which Keratin was manipulative, as he expressed. I was also told about the strife between Mrs. Latress and Keratin. The strife was painted as Keratin not listening and doing what she was told. Also, that Keratin would be glad to see me because it gave her a break from Mrs. Hilton. He made sure to express that I could come to him with anything. Also, I never disclosed that. Also, he never disclosed that he couldn't be trusted as a father figure. Of course, he wouldn't, right? On a serious note, the reality was that I was grateful to be asked if I wanted to leave the home. I mean, I was ready for new scenery and possibly some kind of peace. And as I prepared for a new placement, the reality, once again, would become bittersweet. It was bitter because I never gained a true family and had to leave behind helpful mentors. It was sweet because mentors attempted to ease my stay and I was ready to go. Never in any other home was I told I wanted to be adopted. Equally, never in another home did I experience strife with both the foster parents and foster siblings. And aside from the bus and her time with Miss Latress, I didn't have any other issues with Keratin. Also, Mr. Russell fully revealed to me who he really was towards the end. And much of the strain I encountered was probably because or by Miss Hilton. So you're already aware of her assumptions about me from day one. However, our estranged relationship would also carry outside of the house. At church, I was simply told to sit and not move. It reminded me of the time when Mrs. Angus, that, however, was tolerable. It was at home, school, and her job I felt mostly confined. So during the early part of my stay at the Hiltons, I became involved in outside activities. A few months after my arrival, I participated in a unique camp. DSS had signed me up to participate in a wilderness camp. At the camp, I learned how to adjust to the mountains and outdoor. For a week, I learned how to survive in the wilderness. I learned to work with a group and care for real llamas. Yes, I said llamas. Llamas are mountain animals related to alpacas and camels. With the guidance of professional guides, myself and each child were responsible for one. So on a trail, I made sure to be extra careful. Not only were we high up in the mountains, the trail was small and winding. Noticing we didn't have railing support, I took my time. I didn't want to fall and was scared to make my llama fall as well. Although that trip was years ago, I still found or really still have fond memories of it. So before leaving for that trip, Mr. Hilton randomly gave me a thick sweater and a baseball cap. I was told to wear them as it could be cold in the mountains. On my last day, my picture was taken wearing the items, and back at the house, the Hiltons reviewed my trip photos. I could tell Mrs. Hilton was surprised and disappointed seeing me in the gear. At school, I had to make a call for permission for a class trip. I thought I had asked to attend, but the permission slip was never signed, and I felt and acted like a little kid when Mrs. Hilton told me no. Yeah, this is weird. Never with anyone else I had cried and pleaded to attend a trip so much than I did with her that day. I don't know what came over me. I just felt like I was missing out on something really important. And sadly, due to my pleading, Mrs. Latress paid a visit to the school. I found it especially hurtful that she came again to tell me no. It's like she enjoyed seeing me in a vulnerable state. I guess I deserved it. Being our relationship was already disconnected. My final recollection takes me to the time of being a youth camp counselor. And once again, this camp location would be visited later in life. So the camp was minutes up the road from my final foster care placement. And back as a counselor, I loved connecting with the youth. Unlike with Keratin, the youth were loving and affectionate. They wanted me to watch them during many outdoor activities. Unfortunately, I couldn't learn from my past experience. And I mean that past experience that was back in a certain home. Okay. Another placement, Mrs. Hank's home. Yeah. So unfortunately, I didn't learn from my past experience. And earlier I mentioned a few fiascos dealing with boys, a boy in particular. And this new encounter made the list. So there was this guy named Avery I became fond of. And Avery Haswell had a banana cream complexion with short, wavy hair and deep dimples. Avery was definitely an eye catcher to many other girls, and when he took a notice to me, I didn't question his motives, which I should have, of course, but didn't. Well, in listening to his advances, at least. So around camp, it was assumed that I was his girlfriend, and many of the youth came around asking, are you Avery's girlfriend?" And I wasn't really sure, of the answer. And I shrugged my shoulders in unknown certainty, and that's only because he was kind of like making advances at me. And yeah, I don't know. On 2 separate occasions, I almost got caught up with Avery. All right, so here's some graphic accounts, but I'm gonna try to clean it up. The first time was when he pulled me into the corner outside. Although I liked him, I felt awkward kissing him. The kisses were rushed and he kept grabbing my hand. I wasn't understanding what was happening until I touched his private area that I attempted to yank my hand away from. And then immediately I became aware I was outside because I became fearful of getting caught. I mean, I should have taken that same awareness with Avery, along with me to another day. Well, while the kids were napping, I went to the storage room, cleaning up the equipment, and Avery must have not been, or really must not have seen authority, because he came in behind me, locking the door. So basically, I went into the storage room, and he followed me in there, and I don't know where authority was, but he basically caught me off guard again. Oh gosh, this is bad. This is gonna sound bad, but I didn't learn anything from anything. All right. So before I could get to the door, he grabbed me in a kiss. Once again, things felt rushed as I suddenly found my pants to my knees. Now, I imagine you're probably saying, well, you had to let him. Well, yes, but once again, it was in the heart, or really the heat of the moment. And this time I didn't have someone walking in to fuss me out. Instead, thank goodness, my cycle prevented any progression. Pulling my pants down, Avery said, "Oh," and I had forgotten about my cycle and was reminded, to like I was mine. I'm sorry, I'm thinking about how crazy that was. Okay, so basically, I forgot I was on my cycle, and he basically stopped when he saw the same thing, and it basically took me back to the moment where I was, with Mrs. Hanks, with Mrs. Latresse's mother, who was basically trying to tell me some pointers. And so anyway, yeah, I had forgotten about my cycle and was reminded, seeing my underwear, and now isn't ladylike example, but I know now God intervened. At my apparent ordeal, Avery fixed himself and let me alone in the room. Looking back, I feel horrible. Anyone could have walked in if the door wasn't locked. It wasn't especially planned. I purposely bleed. Yeah, it wasn't especially planned, and I purposely be in that circumstance and situation. So basically, like I said in earlier speakings, very naive, especially in those moments. And like I said before, it's one thing to take sex education, right? But it's another thing, and it kind of seemed like I would have learned with the ordeal at Miss Hanks' house. And then I'm not even talking about Mr. Russell. That's completely crazy, separate situation that's not even in this category. But my situation when in the Hanks' house, it just should have been like a learning point, but it wasn't. And what I was mentioning earlier is like, you can take sex education all day long, but nobody ever teaches what do you do when you're in face of the fire, you're in the moment, in the situation. You're not taught like how to handle that. And because feelings and emotions and just kind of overtakes you, or whatever the situation is overtakes you. So you're not really ever taught. You talk of the up to, but you're not ever taught the inside of. Okay, I hope that made sense. Okay, let me continue because I can get off track. Okay. All right. So, like I said, I really do feel like God intervened because, at my apparent ordeal, Avery fixed himself and left me alone in the room. Looking back, I feel horrible as I did, but anyone could have walked in if the door wasn't locked and if it wasn't especially planned and I purposely be in that circumstance. Furthermore, it wasn't until adulthood I truly learned what to watch out for in a guy. A day or so after I noticed a difference in treatment towards me at camp, I never discovered why Mrs. Jacqueline was standoffish towards me. Mrs. Jacqueline looked to be in her mid-30s, brown skin, and always wore a pushback bun in her hair. Equally, I never saw Avery again, and Miss Latress yanked me from the camp the following week, writing, or during the time of this writing, I've, I've come up with several potential explanations. I now believe Avery went around slandering my name. Although nothing happened between us, I believe the talk caused the distance. I started being told to stay at the camp while other counselors and Miss Jacqueline left on outings. And granted, now I was never pulled in the office being questioned about Avery, so that was another strange thing. But also, Mrs. Hilton never questioned me or discussed knowing about Avery. If it weren't, if it were known, it might have been to protect, it might have been a protection for the camp. I don't know. Whatever the case, I miss the children, the camp, and the freedom that was from Mrs. Latress. Leaving the camp the following week, I started attending work with Mrs. Hilton, and in my immaturity of writing, I scoffed at the place where Mrs. Latress worked. Earlier, I mentioned how God and forgiveness now shapes my writings. So during the earlier stages, I assumed where she worked was hypocritical, meaning, how work in a, meaning how could she work in a godly place, and have disgust towards me. I questioned how she can work there but treated me non-motherly. So at the time, she worked for a gospel radio station. Okay, and I questioned how could she work there but treated me non-motherly. And like I said, and I can imagine now Miss Latress was in survival mode. Not for personal lack, but for attention from Mr. Russell. At that time, I couldn't understand that. I never imagined I'd be looked at as a quote unquote homewrecker, let alone competition. Despite this new understanding, I had to go with a new flow. For maybe 2 weeks, I had pre-packed lunch and had to sit in the front of the radio station. And at the time, Mrs. Hilton worked the welcome desk, but also had brief airtime on the radio. She announced a slogan between music segments, and I watched as Mrs. Latress reluctantly asked questions about who I was. I was also aware that she had a conversation with a coworker about me. So thankfully, after those 2 weeks, I started going to Miss Adams' home with Keratin. So that's where my transition to Miss Adams' home came in at, because of that situation. Man, so yeah. But my time at the radio station now gives me a new appreciation. I can now acknowledge that God can use whomever He pleases. And now in ministry, or learning about ministry, or growing in ministry, I'm starting to appreciate this. There are many biblical examples of many undeserving individuals. Examples included Moses making his wife his sister, Sarah being her maid servant for a child, Sarah using her maid servant for a child, David betrothing Bathsheba. I guess what I'm learning is to die to the spirit of religion and being an equal and not really being hypocritical. That's what I'm trying to say. So basically dying to the spirit of religion and not being equally hypocritical. And years have passed when I ran into Mrs. Hilton at a Christmas party, and taking the initiative to speak wasn't well received. I felt awkward, like my reunion was with Mrs. Angus. At the moment, I didn't see any other children, and I didn't know they were still keeping them. That was disclosed to me much later by her fellow church member, and sadly, I believe Miss Latress still thought I was after her husband. I now think that she was unhappy, but decided to settle. I also don't believe my incident was the first, and looking back, I now know that she knew her husband was guilty. I believe that that's where the undisclosed tension came in between Mr. Hilton and Keratin. What I can take from this experience now is to forgive. Yes, I know from many it's easier said than done, and however, it's only through God's grace and mercy I can now come to it. I mean, I can't forgive in my own strength because I fail every day, all day. That's what prolonged the efforts of this first memoir. I can share now that it's a constant and daily effort, and with every breath and step we're giving. So, King James Version, Isaiah 55:7, let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return to the Lord, and he will have mercy upon him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. So, this scripture isn't just for the sinner, it's for the professing believer. And as the body of Christ, we're held more responsible. I mean, we can't win souls for the kingdom still harboring bitterness and unforgiveness, right? God won't get the glory, and we can't be used due to it. So my new transition was much needed after tension never settled at the home. Like I take the time to once again revisit for specific readers. I can't imagine going through the level of any level of abuse many of you may have experienced. Furthermore, I can't imagine it's more difficult. Well, I can't imagine it's more difficult to forgive because of it. Yet once again, I must say that it's not by my own physical or mental strength. I mean, this strength comes from my growth in who God is and who He's calling me to become and how He desires for me to live. Let me remind you that this takes time. And also, I'm aware that some questions God's assistance because of ordeals you faced. I mean, I've personally met several individuals who have. I'm not here to tell you how you should feel. I'd simply like to share who God is and, how He can get the glory from me. And yes, we live in this world, but we weren't meant to be like this world. Without the truth and acknowledgement of Christ, we're open to sin. Sin is the thoughts, actions, and lives we live rejecting God's truth. God's truth is only found in His Word. Well, at the time of this writing, it was King James, but I have become knowledgeable of other versions, amplified, and our personal growth and relationships with God. The church is supposed to guide you to that truth and knowledge. However, many churches fail. We must look to God for the understanding, truth, and guidance. This isn't always easily, because, or really, this isn't always easy to come to because we fight a real enemy like we serve a real God. The enemy can and does come in all forms. The enemy we face is Satan and ourselves. I mean, Satan can whisper for us to denounce God, our lives, and the lives of others. I mean, this brings about sin and a lot of choices we make. We become our own enemy by our personal emotions. We can become distracted with the lust of the eye, flesh, and pride of life. This isn't to justify any forms of abuse or pinpoint a definite cause. Although these unfortunate things happen, it's not because God desires or orchestrates them to happen. However, I can attest that your ordeals can and does bring healing. This healing and deliverance comes from growth and development in Christ. And what I've experienced is that with this healing, God can use us. He uses us while we're facing the trials. And when we've come out of them, you don't know who you can help and whose life can be or could be affected. Further, your healing can come as you start to witness, serve, and care for others. All right, that was chapter 5. I am about to dive into chapter 6. I'm going to jump right into it because I did a lot of talking today, right? All right, chapter 6, Standing Alone. If you're following along, I'm starting on page 97. Okay, so after leaving the Hilton home, I went to live in Camden, South Carolina. I was briefed about the distance and the fact that it was therapeutic. Now, as a 15-year-old meeting my new family, I fell into place quicker than before. The Rentons were a lot nicer than all the other placements except for Miss May and Miss Hanks, of course. Doris Renton was a short, light-skinned woman with curly red hair, thin silver glasses, and brown freckles. Her daughter, Natelle, was around 18 and favored Mrs. Doris minus the freckles. Mr. Raymond Renton was also friendly and engaging. His dark skin with a stocky frame, and he wore thin rimmed glasses. Entering this home, I was more on edge than times before. I didn't want to put my heart out there only to find another disappointment. But surprisingly, I was welcomed in from the very start. Like the Angus home, the house was full of people with therapeutic needs. The therapeutic side came, like I said, therapeutic foster placements. They have a license to be able to care for people who have, medical, extreme to minor medical needs. So that's where the Angus home came in for me when I had to have my corrective surgeries. All right, top of 98. And when I met the Renton brothers, so that sentence was, the therapeutic side came in when I met the Renton brothers. So Arthur was around 12 years old, foster child, but appeared much younger. I felt sorry for him because he was confined to a wheelchair and unable to speak for him or function for himself. Arthur had smooth brown skin with a close haircut with thick black eyebrows. He often looked around the sky with his large brown eyes, wandering everywhere. His hands were folded in, not allowing him to hold or grasp objects. I also felt bad because he was restricted to feeding tubes through his stomach. I watched as both Miss Doris and Nantel handled Arthur with care. Seeing him enunciated with tools and reminded me of my stay in the hospital. Later during my first night, I met Alan. He was the Renton's older son. He had to be a year or two older than Nantel, who was maybe 18 at the time, and Alan looked very young for his age, too. He was also very nice. Alan was dark-skinned like his father, with a close-cut haircut like Arthur. He was crippled from birth, so when he moved around with his arms, he had crutches. His legs just dragged along the side to help guide him around the house. Another first, as there were more health needs and needs were for both foster brothers. And despite this, I never met a family prior as close and unified. Like with Miss Hanks, I was given the freedom to cook and make neighborhood friends. I received life counsel from Mr. Renton and teamwork values from Mrs. Doris and Nantel. Yet, at the time, I wasn't appreciative of those lessons or on teamwork. I wasn't that I didn't want to be a team player. My new mentality was at work. So, sorry, that's car noise in the background. So I wasn't trying to not be a team player. I just had matured into one. Let's say it that way. I'll get more into this a little later, but for now, I had a new school to adjust to. And even though the family was welcoming, my new schoolmates weren't like all my prior schools. I felt unpretty and didn't fit in. The high school was a lot bigger than most recent schools, or most schools. And during my first week, I attended a drug prevention presentation in the auditorium. I must have been in the 9th grade when I came in, and inside the auditorium, I noticed droves of students, especially the girls, and how popular and pretty they seemed. Then the shock value of the presentation caught my attention. We were shown a picture of a woman kissing on a dog. The woman was clearly naked, though blacked out enough for us to get the point. And the presenters obviously wanted us to focus on the effects of drugs. Lunchtime was also like many other schools. I was lonely and secluded. Not that I was excluded, but tried to get comfortable as my peers sat with their friends. My classes would take me to basic academics, which included woodshop. In woodshop class, I admired the cute guys and compared myself to the other girls. It's taken me up to these writings to fully appreciate I was never supposed to fit in. And once again, I said well into adulthood, right? It has taken me well into adulthood to finally understand I was never supposed to fit in. Okay, let's continue. I imagine for anyone reading or now listening, that's also easier said than done. It's one thing vying for the attention at home, it's another thing to fit in with peers. High school was just that constant reminder of competition, acceptance, and individuality. Many times the ministry can feel a lot like high school. I mean, this is true, especially accepting my prophetic call from God and not man. Okay, that's book 3. Now I understand that rejection from peers, family, and even myself can carry over into adulthood if unresolved. And for me, I'm learning each day to put forth efforts to cast out cares at the feet of God. I'm not telling you that it's always easy, which is not. And daily we must die to our flesh while living in a world that rejects God. Equally, we must know who God has called us to be above what man people say we are. And this reality, understanding, acceptance can heal years of page 100, feeling rejected, feeling used and misunderstood. However, before this understanding came, I had to make it through many more years of life. At home, I was introduced to a neighborhood girl who I started visiting. Latavia Alston was a year or so younger than me. She had thick black eyebrows, a wide smile, and more developed frame. She was a go-to neighbor, and was just as friendly as the Rentons. Unlike Alicia, she wasn't as adventurous around the neighborhood, and these visits became brief. While I also visited her twin cousins, Mallory and Valerie, were a few years older and identical. Each girl was slender, had long, straight hair, and petite frames. My visits with them were eventually cut short when the Rentons required another foster daughter in the home. Vanessa was also a year or so younger than me, yet she had a lot more life experience than I did. Vanessa was tall, light skinned, and more developed like Latavia. Vanessa reminded me of the girls back at the party with Alicia. I mean, I believe now her life experience detached much of her behavior. I couldn't really connect to Vanessa because she was kind of wild. Other than riding the bus, we really weren't around each other like that. And Vanessa wasn't in the Renton home long after her arrival, I believe because she was caught with a boy, which aided in her removal. And me saying that is weird because of the plenty of times I could have been called as well. I'm getting into that later on, right? During the weekends, I noticed that Miss Dolores and Natal had a weekend tradition of cleaning a local set of churches. And at the time, I started to resent going to clean the churches. Now, this is going to sound very bad. And once again, maybe I think a lot of it was because of what I heard in history books and what I always heard on TV. So parents, you really got to enforce positive ways of thinking in your youth, because if not, a lot of times your youth are going to bring back misinformation, whether it's in their high school textbooks or their school textbooks or because of news and media. I'm going to just say that and just know that this was my thinking at that time. It's not my thinking now. Okay, let's continue. All right, here we go. So at the time I started to resent going to clean the churches. This was where my lack of teamwork ethics came into play. I started to resent cleaning the churches mainly because they were predominantly white. Yes, I said that. This mindset was only based off my history lessons. Yeah, this is where I came in. I was being refreshed on American slavery during this time, of all things at all times. After the next set of churches, I asked Mrs. Doris again why she cleaned Clem and told her how demeaning I thought it was. And she was so sweet. And just for me to even just think about it now, I'm just like, I was so immature. Y'all. Okay. It's a difference when that's the person's job and they're doing their job because they enjoy their job. It has nothing to do at the time. That just me growing into immaturity. So just to say that. All right. Several times they had explained being friends with the pastor. Despite that explanation, I still felt it was degrading. I couldn't come to terms with their response based off what history was teaching me in school. That's where that came from. Now writing this or then writing that, I compared my mentality to the older generation. I mean, to this day, I hear Black elders ranting. They rant a lot about the injustices of slavery and inequality, as we always are seeing in news and media. But There have been times I've had to catch myself, especially when I'm passionate about a topic, a cause, or injustice, as you have heard earlier in my rantings. I've also gotten fired up due to it. I mean, I never saw the other churches that were clean, just the big ones I visited on the weekend. I mean, the church was huge, as it was 2 to 3 stories with multiple rooms, inclusive of an indoor basketball court. Cleaning the church interior was draining as we swept the carpet of the church. All the carpet had to lay the same way. I mean, I often pondered why they just didn't use a vacuum. Although I didn't want to clean the church, I really enjoyed going inside the youth classrooms to clean. I mean, the rooms had posters of Christian groups like Out of Eden, where whose music I grew to listen and enjoy. Inside those youth classrooms, I did have moments of wanting to attend the church and join the youth activities. So, in a way, I mean, it was kind of working on me in the positive way it should have been working on me. So, okay. So, my whining about cleaning the churches finally came to an end. I was introduced to a close friend of Mrs. Renton, the Estelles, a couple who lived in the next town over. Their daughter and grandchildren lived in the same town. I never discovered how the Rentons and Estelles knew each other, but I suddenly started visiting them. This new relationship introduced me to the holiness religion. And no, I'm not holiness. Now I'm just humble servant of Christ. Okay. Page 102. Marvine and Harriet Estelle were elderly, dark skinned, and kind hearted. Miss Harriet had a black mold on her face and only wore glasses when she had to read. Mr. Marvin was blind and hard of hearing. One of their daughters and grandchildren lived with them. Henrika looked to be in her mid 30s and had a dark complexion, much like her parents. Jonathan was about 5. He favored his parents in wide eyed features and complexion. I was introduced to Miss Estelle's other daughter and their grandchildren. Henrika's older sister, Glendale, stayed within 10 minutes of their home with her 4 children. Miss Glendale was in her early to mid 40s with brown skin, thick eyebrows, and a heavy set frame. Often she opened her home for me to stay. Excuse me. When she left for work, I was 2 years younger than her oldest daughter, Morgan, and Morgan looked like her mom in appearance but wore glasses and had a beautiful singing voice. I get to witness her voice as I started attending church services with the Estelles. Morgan had 3 younger siblings. Her sister, Bianca, was 3 or 4 years younger than me, while her 2 brothers were maybe 2 years apart in age. So Bianca and her brothers had different fathers from Morgan and all had lighter complexions. Spending time with Morgan was the only reason I wanted to attend their church. I mean, I felt kind of forced to attend with the Estelles, yet with Morgan and her siblings, I felt it was by choice. I was exposed to the Baptist faith with Mrs. Bertha and Mrs. Latress. I mean, I scratched my head with questions now going to a holiness church. Now, I often acknowledge now I go to a church and compare how my family or the family acted in relation to the preaching. For me, the previous placements failed. I only assumed the Rentons didn't go to church because I never attended with them. However, who's to say they didn't attend church? The churches they cleaned or had to work or on Sundays. I mean, whatever the case, the Rentons family were still the epitome of a good family. The Estelles attended the Holiness Church, therefore I had to attend since it was in their, or I was in their case, in their care. But getting tongue tied. I had to attend since I was in their care. And as an adult, I've learned the difference between the different faiths, but had to come to a personal choice on my own. Back at the Holiness Church, Holy Waters, all I had to do was well, all I had to go on was my own surroundings and the messages preached. I witnessed how the other youth, along with Morgan, acted, and I heard the messages preached, but it never stuck with me. Either way, I felt the atmosphere and the people were both extreme. Let me express that growing up, I learned a lot attending a lot of churches. Let me rephrase that. I learned a lot attending a lot of churches, and I definitely did. God has now pulled me out of the church as part of my ministry, or should I say, growing into ministry. I'm not here to compare one church to another. Yet my desire is for everyone to come to the unadulterated and untainted truth of Christ. Earlier, I mentioned that this truth comes by reading the Word and having a personal relationship with God. And although it's assumed that man wrote the Bible, God used those men and a lot of those ambassadors, that I call them, to give us relevance of the Word even to this day. And later in part 3, I'll go deeper into my journey, I guess my spiritual journey, and I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. All right, let's continue. So like I said, it's for now, it's just we have to know, or really have for now, just know we have a real God who loves us and who fights a real enemy that wants to destroy us. And if you could take anything from that, okay. It's our personal efforts to seek and find the truth. With our daily lives, we must push towards a higher mark, the higher calling God has placed over our lives. And that's when I talk about finding your purpose. That's what I'm referring to. So back at Holy Waters, I was taken back being told they don't celebrate Christmas or birthdays, yet the sensual actions of the other youths made me question what was right and what was real. However, being able to attend with Morgan made going to Holy Waters more tolerable. Morgan was already part of the choir, so I followed suit to be closer to her. Not to mention I favored the guy who flirted with me at church. Although the Estelles loved Morgan, Miss Harriet warned me not to get caught with her granddaughter. I never say anything against Morgan, but often felt bad when she mouthed at her grandparents and behind their backs. This would be the first time I was warned about a sibling. Unfortunately, I didn't learn from my time with Alicia and still got caught up. Morgan became my away from home sister that I always wanted. And even though I was 15, I still hadn't learned how to act as an individual. Continuing my stay, I joined JROTC and learned how to keep and maintain my uniform. So JROTC stands for Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps. It is a military regulated high school program whose purpose is to educate high school students in leadership roles while making them aware of the benefits of citizenship. Now, let me express that JROTC was a requirement at the school. It was optional at other schools. So yeah, it was required at that school. At my school, taking JROTC was a requirement, like I just said. Also, the drill team taught me leadership skills. I know I was just a teenager, but I thought, okay. I know I was just a teenager, but I thought our drill sergeant was so handsome. I have to say that. And even to this day, I don't know. I actually saw him a couple years ago. Still looks the same, even though he's older. Oh my gosh. Okay. Like I said, I know I was just a teenager, but I thought our drill sergeant was so handsome. Take the time to think of Denzel Washington's smile. Yeah, that kind of presence. First Sergeant Presley exuded. I remember seeing him later as an adult in the store, like I just said, and I laughed seeing he still looked the same. My duration at this home took me to drill meets, taught me discipline, and pushed me in a new rebellion. Drill meets were part of my involvement with JRTC. At the time, I wasn't aware of how the military had infiltrated the schools. At all my other schools, JRTC was optional, like I said, and JRTC would be the beginning of renewed personal focus and confidence boost. I voluntarily joined the drill team as part of my involvement with the leadership program. I was especially excited to be on the same team with Lawrence Wilkerson. I gotta stay focused on that. With Lawrence Wilkerson, Lawrence was the guy every girl liked and every guy wanted to be. I know I never had a chance with him, but he was nice to admire from a distance. The drill team taught me how to flip and spin plastic rifles, while the leadership training taught me cadence, teamwork, and responsibility. these lessons would carry me over with Mrs. Harriet Renton's. When Miss Harriet Renton signed me up for Taekwondo, a form of martial arts like karate. All right. At a local community center, I wanted to be part of the. So let me rephrase that. Those lessons carried me over, and yeah, Miss Renton, when Miss Renton signed me up for the martial arts, it was at a local community center. So I wanted to be part of the dance team, but Miss Renton felt Taekwondo would help me in my personal development. I mean, I must admit, she was right. I mean, taking up the martial arts helped my confidence, personal development greatly, and taught me perseverance, strength, and focus, which I greatly needed. Not only would my mind often wander in school, I had to focus in Taekwondo. I mean, I wasn't distracted by the training. I was distracted by the cute twins that helped me train and wore black belts. Once again, I had to stay focused. Entering Taekwondo class, I recognized the twins from the drill meets. Although I still wished to dance, the twins in class would keep my focus. There was a brief period when I lived with Miss Angus that she let me go to a dance class. This lasted for a moment because the lady at the student center kept asking about me. I was told I was a natural but didn't have a chance to run with it. All too often, I watched Patrice take piano lessons, enter talent showcases, and have glamour shots. Writing, at the time of this writing, I'm starting to ponder if Patrice had influence in my church and extracurricular involvement. I'm not sure, but at the time I became excited at the possibilities, and Patrice told me that I was going to be in gymnastics until Miss Bertha changed her mind. I mean, I wasn't aware at the time that I was being watched flipping on the backyard trampoline. And equally, I enjoyed making mud pies, playing tetherball, and swinging on the tree. The same day, Patrice told, and Patrice, for those of you who are wondering, was back in chapter 2 or 3. I'm in 4. Yeah, that whole situation with Miss Angus. All right. So the same day Patrice told me about gymnastics was the same day I went outside making mud pies. Not jumping on the trampoline that day may have aided in a negative decision. I must reflect how that brief dance opportunity felt so natural. It takes me back to the joyous feeling I get from being part of stage productions, writings, and these memoirs, and cooking. Taekwondo, however, was the confidence boost I needed that would help me later in life. I mean, understanding understanding Mrs. Renton's intent now, I can say, give me a second. Until now, I can say I appreciate the responsibility and discipline they wanted to instill in me. I mean, I might have grown as an adult through Rentons if it wasn't for my new rebellion. So, despite going well at school and home, I became rebellious in my growing time with Morgan. Plenty of time, Miss Estelle warned me not to follow Morgan up because she was a little older and out there. Even though Morgan attended church, she was still caught up with boys and not listening to her grandparents. Mrs. Estelle saw the vulnerability in me and had my best interest in mind. I mean, at the time, I couldn't acknowledge this. I felt an overwhelming need to defend and protect Morgan because she was my quote unquote friend. More so, I didn't defend her to the Estelles, but to the Rentons. It got to the point that Morgan's rebellion started rubbing off on me. And at that time, I couldn't recall the negative influence I had from Alicia and April. And even though I didn't approve of Morgan's boyfriend, I followed her as a sort of protector. I mean, I wasn't aware how much danger I could have been in. Equally, trouble the Rentons and the Stells could have been in, that I could have gotten them in with the agency. So the day Morgan and I decided to visit her boyfriend's house, I was blinded by the warnings from her grandmother, and the day she expressed for me not to say anything, much like the influence of April. Although I didn't get caught up with the boys, following Morgan didn't sit well with our authorities. My wanting to protect Morgan would be the very thing to get me removed from the Renton's home. I mean, receiving concerns from the Estelles and Miss Renton talking to me a few times about following Morgan up, it just really became too much. So before these series of talks, I blossomed more. JRTC and Taekwondo started aiding in my personal development, while singing on the choir and spending time with the Estelles aided in my developing personal relationships. However, not knowing where I went with Morgan became the last straw. I mean, the day I wandered off with Morgan was the same day she got into it with her boyfriend. I stayed outside in the yard full of strangers at a strange house I never visited before. I think Morgan's boyfriend hit her, and she was forced to contact her mother for help. Mrs. Renton and Mrs. Estelle questioned me about the situation, and apparent that I wanted to protect Morgan. The Rentons came to the decision to have me removed. So at the time of this writing, I had really had to learn some tough life lessons over the years. I had to learn that following up any wrong never brings good outcomes. Let me say that again. I had to learn over the years that following up any wrong, no matter if you're defending the person or not, it never brings any good outcomes. It would become the very lesson God had to develop me in many years during my life. I mean, it wasn't that I agreed with the wrong, it was because I always wanted to see the good in the person. That's not a bad thing. It's just a lesson on being more aware of my surroundings, and a hard pill I've had to revisit even, well, during the time of this writing and daily. The efforts wasn't to be mean or ignore people. It's just that top of 108 that the enemy and your emotions will oftentimes get you in trouble. This is especially true if you're not aware of the underlying causes or circumstances. An example could be wanting to hold a baby lion. Although it looks cute, it's a natural predator that isn't meant to be a house pet. For now, my vulnerability with Morgan embraced a rebellious spirit. That rebellious or that rebellion to protect her caused my removal. And looking back at that, I now understand everything the Rentons and Miss Harriet was trying to warn me about. I mean, I appreciate them from really being an example of a family I can look to. I also wish I could have expressed this to the Estelles, but they passed away a couple years back, and this was revealed in an update call I had with Morgan about a year or so ago. I reached out to her to catch up and also to inquire about, bringing potential theatrical opportunities to her area. I mean, expressing she's getting married the following year, I became excited until she said she's not marrying a man but a woman. Well, now I know this is a touchy subject for many people. However, I'm still mandated to speak the truth of the gospel in love. My efforts are to lead souls to Christ, and I'll be responsible if that blood is on my hands at the time I was writing, right? Meaning I can't go against God's will and his word, and if he mandates me to speak, I have to. So if I twist or compromise from it, it's like me really killing the souls he desires to use for his glory and to save. And I'm kind of chopping that up, but basically during my development, my growth, and that's why book 3 will be dedicated to that. In my spiritual journey, I went through the ringer of churches and religion and just different stuff. But reading this now, I want to express that God can meet us at whatever point we're in our lives, and he doesn't condemn people to hell because you're this or you're that. He wants to meet us right where we are. And a lot of times we turn to situations and circumstances because of hurt, because of trauma, because of unresolved issues, thinking that we'll find love there. And that's not always the best answer or the best case. And once again, God is, he truly loves each person individually. But we each individually have to come to that truth in ourselves. It's not forced and it's not hateful, but it's truth. He would never distort his truth. But that is a journey that each of us, myself included, has to continuously seek and desire to make. And He then reveals, you know, how we could be healed, delivered, set free. And once again, it's a daily effort. No one got it all down pat, and no one is perfect, and no one has arrived. Okay, let me express that. All right, so back on the phone with Morgan, I expressed no, in which she said, by my reaction, well, nothing was wrong with that. I mean, I expressed how I know your grandmother didn't raise her that way. Basically, I told her I expressed how her grandmother didn't raise her that way and would be disappointed. And that conversation was now a few years back, of course. And however, it's still my desire to pray for her and petition to her and others in true love of Christ. And then, like I said, yes, Christ is love, but no sin is greater or weaker than the next. I mean, it's all sin. And lying is equal to murder in the sight of God. Once again, it takes a daily effort to die to our flesh, sins, and the world, and cares for our lives. Our part is to desire to grow and draw closer to God, and this takes time, efforts, and desire to do so. Further efforts lead us to discover His purpose for our lives and to accept and walk in the fullness of that purpose. And like I said, I'll expound more on that in that journey in book 4, or excuse me, book 3. Book 4 is, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. I will expound more on that journey in book 3. All right, Morgan continued to ask if I had a boyfriend, expressing no. She said good, and not to get one either. She elaborated how she was hurt and that was the reason to marrying her girlfriend. And all I could think was the warnings from Miss Estelle and Miss Renton. I mean, I revealed to Morgan that I was married to Jesus. And she, laughing, basically, she expressed He was the only thing I should marry. Okay, so basically I told her I was married to Jesus, and she was laughing, saying that he was the only person I could marry. I don't know. Okay. That was that conversation at that time. Okay. He was the only thing I should be married to, and it broke my heart because her expressing that showed me she knew the truth. I mean, it's only one thing to know the truth of Christ and being our sin and deception. It's another to know the truth and turn back to sin and ways of the world. So basically, in our conversation, I told her I'll keep her and her family lifted in prayer, which, of course, this reminded me of the retaliation I received for sharing the gospel with Clayton, an ex-male coworker. Okay, so I'm talking a little bit about, book 3. But so I received, this reminded me of the retaliation I received for sharing the gospel with a Clayton and a ex-male coworker. And as a servant of Christ, I can't be afraid to lose more. If I reach but one, it's all worth hearing those precious words, well done, thy good and faithful servant. And once again, I wrote this book a couple years ago, and at the end of the day, God truly does meet us right where we are. He's not condemning, despite, a lot of what we're taught in church, which is why I feel like a lot of churches need a reset button. But let me not get off topic. I'm book 3. So growing in my ministry walk has taught me humility and boldness. Both are needed to stand on the truth and knowledge of Christ, mandated to speak the truth and intercede for the hearts and minds of people everywhere. And once again, I've gone through the ringer, so I'll share all that in book 3, to the point where I'm maturing bit by bit now, and I'll share about that too. Equally, I must stay obedient and humble to the calling in which I'm developing. Like I said, I'm still developing. No one arrives, be 185 and still have something to learn. So let me say that. Leaving the Renton's home was more bitter than sweet. This family was the total package, and I knew I blew it. This was the placement I mentioned earlier, crying about the girl revealing she had been molested on the talk show. I mean, the only update I have is seeing a much older Natal years later at the time I told her I was going to school and had a roommate, and being older, Natelle favored her mom even more. This reunion wasn't as awkward as the prior ones. I asked about everyone and inquired if she can say hi for me. Proceeding to the next stop challenged me even more. As a growing teenager, I needed more guidance and direction. In my new home, I get a lot of guidance, but it was the direction I chose to take that aided or really added to the memories of this testimony for others. All right, so that was chapter 6. I thank you for your patience. I'm usually done at the 2 hour mark, but yeah, that was chapter 6. And for those of you who've been following, I'm super excited to conclude my reading next week of Foster in chapters 7. What was I thinking? And chapter 8, the unexpected milestone. Yeah, this month has been awesome. January, my birthday month, has been awesome sharing this testimony with you through this book. And once again, I wrote this book a couple years ago, but an updated version of this is being revamped like as we speak. So when that is ready to be released, I will let y'all know. And not just that, the other 2 writings that's paired with this is finally going to be released as well. So hopefully maybe I can make it a bundle deal. We'll see. But yeah, that was Foster chapters 5 and 6. And I really appreciate each and every one of you who were able to listen in this week. I know these readings are long, or, if you're catching part of it, feel free to listen to this when you have some downtime. And hopefully I can, soothe your day. I don't know. With my words, I don't know. All right, so I do have a comment, and I'm just going to go back to it. Okay. Oh, what's up, Caprice? My friend Caprice, who's also my Zumba instructor, who's also my skating buddy, said good afternoon, but that was round 1. So I don't know if you're still on, Caprice, but what's up? Yeah, so once again, this was the reading of Foster chapters 5 and 6. And once again, I hope you're able to attend or go back and watch the replay of this content. And once again, and then next week is the last week, reading my last 2 chapters for Foster. And once again, if you missed that content, I will have all the stuff on replays as I do on each of the pages for you to go back and see. And let me see, can I show you where you can get content? So if you're listening now, you're on one of the pages that I have stuff posted. So let's see. Okay, here we go. Well, we're already on the page. All right, give me a second. There we go. I think you see this one. Yep, there we go. Yeah, so if you're on this page watching, thanks for watching. And or whatever page you're watching from, you may be on the Fmstori Plus main Facebook page, the Chosen Writer Facebook page, which is the author Shalina Michelle Tate page, or you may be coming on the Foster My Story author YouTube page. Whatever place you're watching from, I really, 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 really appreciate you taking time to listen to chapters 5 and 6 of Foster today. I hope you have time to, when you're settled, catch the whole replay in your downtime. And if you have any questions for me, feel free to inbox me or whatnot. And I look forward to sharing the last 2 chapters of Foster. It came so fast with you next Saturday, same time, 12 p.m. Eastern time, as I conclude the reading of Foster. And I will be sharing with you some updates. Like I said, I have some new material in the works as we speak right now. And I'm also updating Foster for you. So I'm excited about that as well. Yeah, but if you enjoyed this content, right, let me go to it. I really could use your help. So Foster is on Amazon. And if you want to read along, I've been basically telling people to grab the Kindle copy because the hardback copy would let's see, sorry, it'll probably take a couple of days to get to you. But yeah, you get the Kindle edition and read right along, or if you want to get your copy, you can as well. And What I would like those of you who have read Fostered or is thinking about getting Fostered and reading it, if you could come on the page, and once again, it's Foster, Fostered, by my name right here, Shalina Michelle Tate, which is also on my author Shalina Michelle Tate page if you need the spelling. Come on Amazon.com, and if you can leave a comment, like right here where it has the stars, if you can leave a rating and leave a comment on what you thought about the book, that I really appreciate that, because I'm going to be using those reviews for my upcoming website, which will be unveiled in time. Everything is timing, right? So I want to put your reviews on the website so other people will know like how you experience Foster. All right, well, once again, I'm author Shalina Michelle Tate. I read today chapters 5 and 6 of Foster. I really appreciate y'all joining me on this journey. And let's see. So far, we've covered, man, y'all are awesome. And once again, the replays for these videos or on any of these pages that you're watching it from. So far, we've covered introduction, Daddy's Little Girl, introducing foster care. I could have died. Meeting number 1. Today we covered hands-on kind of person and standing alone. And then the next week is the last week of chapter 7. What was I thinking? And chapter 8, the unexpected milestone. So excited. Book 2, Entangled, is going to take you into transitioning into adulthood. A lot of times that's not really talked about that much. You know, it's one thing to go through the foster care system. It's another thing to transition out of foster care and then being emancipated into adulthood. And if you really hadn't had like a strong foundation as mentors, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's good foster parents, there's good homes, there's good mentors, but a lot of times that's a struggle for a lot of kids leaving the system. And for me, I mean, I didn't really emancipate out till I was 21. I was forced to, because that's when they closed your case at 21. So I was out there. So I'm gonna share that journey in 2, and then we'll talk about my spiritual journey and all the stuff I went through dealing with that. But still, hey, I mean, it's made me grow into the young woman I am today, like in the truth of God and His love. But then there's some other projects I'm working on as well. I'm working on short films and foster care content. So I'm super excited for this journey that you're on with me. Hey, and if you have any questions or you want to inbox me about anything, feel free to do so. I'm not a stranger, and I'll read it when I get a chance and respond as time permits. And I hope to really, get you to, enjoy last week of Foster, and then stay tuned for February, where Foster My Stories podcast returns. Super excited about that, and new content that's going to be coming to you really soon. All right, well, like I say all the time on the podcast, being fostered, adopted, orphaned, and underserved is what I like to call gracefully chosen. And gracefully chosen is a name I would like to give to those labeled foster, adopted, orphan, underserved. You're gracefully chosen because you have a purpose. Despite your circumstance and situation, you've gone through those situations and circumstances for a greater purpose. You're gracefully chosen. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing some more comments and being able to connect with you next week for the final reading of Foster chapters 7 and 8. Take care.